So Dove was 9. You saw the therapies he had. I bet a lot of you, they resonated with the nonverbal kids and trying to get them to talk and trying to deal with all the behaviors and not knowing how to help them. And through our organization, I heard of this boy, Tito, who, from what I heard, had all the low-functioning behaviors but had 185 IQ. And once I heard of him, I had to find him because I'd never heard of anything like this. I'd never heard of anybody in the world who acted like my son but had this intelligence. So I did track them down, and through our organization, CAN, was able to bring them to the United States. And Soma told to be studied by neuroscientists, Tito, because we never have anyone like him, to open a window to what's going on, right? I mean, if you can't talk or write or gesture, then we never know how your brain is working. And he could type very well and handwrite. So his mother, Soma, said she saw him staring at letters and numbers when he was around 1.5, 2 years old. She said he made very good eye contact with the calendar. And she was smart enough. They had already said he's retarded by the time he was 3 and, sort of the get on with your life type message. But she was so observant. She noticed that, he was so obsessed with numbers that she thought she was going to try something and see if, for example, she gave 1 and 3 and then gave him a choice of, let's say, 2 and 5 and said which one comes in between. And in the meantime, she was working on pointing and isolating the finger. And this is what she told me was her first step, was she realized somehow on her own, it was kind of ingenious. Instead of thinking, oh, that's just bad, weird behavior, stop staring at the calendar, she realized that that's where his attention was, and that this was a sequence of information, and that if she could get him to show her that he knew where something went in that sequence, she could build on it. Once she got the numbers, she went straight to the alphabet. And I'm not going to go into all the details of where she went from there. It was a lot of trial and error experimentation. She worked with him around the clock by herself, lived alone with him in Bangalore, India, previous to coming to the United States. By the time he was 6, he started composing short poems by pointing at a letterboard, like you saw Dove using. By 7, she had taught him to write by hand, which took over a year, working several hours a day. She was very intensively devoted. They didn't have access to a keyboard like an electronic keyboard or a typewriter or anything like that. She used the same method to teach him to make lines and eventually form letters and words on paper. So the same prompting she used to keep him pointing, like almost like a metronome, she began to eventually, a lot of professionals, even when she would come to them, the story behind it is she'd bring these little poems, say, look, even when she took him to the doctor, he's got intelligence, and they'd say, lady, you wrote that. And so, there was no evidence, there was no track. So she figured if she could get him to handwrite, even though it was extremely difficult. So what she did was have him, with that same kind of prompting system, go from point A to point B with a pencil. So once she could do that, he could do this. Once he could do this, it might take a really long time, then a diagonal, then he could put 2 things together, then he could do T's, then he could do L's. Curves came much later. And in that very laborious way, he learned to write. And to this day, when he writes, he needs to be prompted along. If you just let him write on his own, he'll look at the ceiling and each letter will be on top of the last one. They won't actually go like this. She has to keep him moving this way. He'll just detach. He'll be doing the letters. There will be words buried in there, but you could never read them. So his attention needs to be continuously prompted. Okay. And over several years, she developed and refined her method. And eventually, the Autism Society in England heard about him, and they thought he can't possibly really be autistic. He's got all the symptoms of low-functioning autism, but if he, either he's not smart or he's not low-functioning, he's not really autistic. So they paid for him to come to England. They ran every kind of test by him, and then they said, he's autistic, and he has 185 IQ. And then they said, he's 1 in a million. He wrote that poetry book, which the Autism Society of England published. So when they came to the United States, Tito was a young teenager. And this was the beginning of a time, that's my son Dove with him, when I arranged ahead of time through the foundation to have different scientists. This is Sarah Spence. She was the neurologist at our gene bank. She was doing the basic formal standardized autism, the ADIR, these research diagnostic tools, because if we were ever going to publish anything based on what he was telling us and we were learning, he had to have those kind of diagnoses. And that's just a list of some of the labs he went to during the time he was here. And this is kind of interesting. I think people might be kind of interested in this. Temple Grandin, you probably recognize. Well, this gets to something that I think, I want to talk about in a little bit, which is everybody generally says that people with autism are so visual. And once a child, like my child Dove, is, let's say, 3 years old and he's not talking, the words are pretty much taken away and he's surrounded by pictures because everyone assumes that his receptive language is no good because he has no output. Now, what Tito described to us, and I don't have time here, believe it or not, with 2 hours, to go into a lot of detail, but in essence, what he told the scientists and what they tested him with all kinds of different tests, and it really bore out, was that the more he focused on something to pay attention, the more his senses split apart. If he was really listening, he stopped hearing. We all do this to a degree. If you've ever been driving down the road and you're thinking about you're going to paint your kitchen and, oh, God, you missed your turn. Well, it wasn't exactly black, but you didn't see it either. It's attentional blindness. He had such extreme attentional blindness, and we interviewed him a lot, and he described when he was a toddler and a young child that it was just chaos. Like, he said things would go together wrong even. Like, he'd see something and hear a word, and he couldn't get them apart. So he tended to do what you see a lot of so-called low-functioning kids do, which is do this. Like, don't look at things and really listen. Because in this way, he could form kind of a database of information and knowledge that was stable and made sense, that wasn't just this chaotic thing that he said he literally couldn't make sense of the world. Now, as we did all this experimentation, we were so fortunate to get Temple Grandin to come in because we began to have this idea that some autistic people are very visual, which we already know. It's usually the ones who can tell us they are. And some autistic people, like Tito, may be very auditory and actually have very good receptive language, but no way to demonstrate it, or that they have it. And these are the very kids that get surrounded by PECs by age 3 and diagnosed with mental retardation. So we tested them side to side at the University of California, San Francisco. This is Mike Merznick down here with Temple. He invented the Fast Forward program and some others. He's a neuroscientist. His specialty is neuroplasticity and neural retraining. They were tested side by side, and it played out pretty well. If you gave any example, like Temple, what happens to you when you go to a movie? She goes, I watch movies normally. I have no problem with movies. Only there is one thing: I can't follow the plot. So that's the verbal auditory part. And you say to Tito, what do you think of movies? He goes, I don't see why you should pay money to sit in the dark and listen to something. And it was coming, like, interestingly, their brains kind of worked the same way, but they were using, like, highly preferred type of sensory information, just different. We have no idea why. This is what started to develop as a kind of a model. And this is just a hypothesis, but I do think that there probably are a significant number of the nonverbal kids who have receptive language, are understanding, have no way of letting you know, and really get bombarded with pictures, which isolates them even more. Now, that gets to literacy and language. It's very counterintuitive. When my son began to communicate, after the first couple of days of having him spell out words and things, it was like one dawning after another. Oh, well, he must be able to read. But, when did he learn? He said he learned at 6. We were teaching him the Lovaas reading program then, but he had 20 sight words, but couldn't use them functionally whatsoever or generate anything besides them. Seemed to have no phonemic awareness. And, I just remember the day that day thinking, he's got it, and then having a flash, I can ask him a question in writing and get him to answer. And if I didn't say anything, then he must have read it. And I think I said, what color's a lemon? And he pointed at yellow instead of red or something like that. And I thought, oh my God, of course he is reading. And then I whipped through book after book, working my way up, starting with like a simple one-word picture book, till I got almost to his level of what he should have been. It was, this whole period was very shocking for me, as you can imagine. Whoops. Hold on, let me see if I can get this to work here. This is just Tito at that time, what he was like. He's at his psychologist's.
And what Why do you think you're agitated? See?
You can see how well he types.
Why?
Also, it's not natural for him to look at the keyboard. He has to be redirected a lot to it.
With my have nots on. I cannot it. Cannot it. Be.
He's trying to talk the whole time. He's very apraxic, like so many of these kids are.
I cannot be contented.
With my have-nots, is that?
Yeah, with my have-nots, I cannot be contented.
And what are some of your have-nots?
Tito. Tito.
185 IQ. I mean, it just shows you behavior and cognition don't always match developmentally.
I think I when never have on normal never have a normal life.
And what do you mean by normal life?
Now, Tito would, there was an aide there, it was not in camera, but Tito would jump up and run out. And we didn't want the shrink to have to follow him and get sued, or his mother to have to follow him since he was going to a psychologist. So the aide would run after him and bring him back. Otherwise, he'd just get in the elevator and disappear. I mean, so.
Reggie, you. What you live?
And what aspect of the life did I live?
What do you do?
Okay, I'm going to.
Answer.
Oh.
How many?
Six.
How many children do you have?
I have no children.
Answer.
So you can hear her really prompting him, kind of roughly almost.
Answer.
I'm not necessarily recommending that, but it's.
Thank God.
It's notable. So I asked the question at this time, you know, when they were here and Tito was being tested and he was telling us all this stuff about his senses and how he processed things, and in essence it was explained to us why he was the way he was. But the big question was he 1 in a million? Because, you know, you don't see this too often. But then, and you already saw the film you saw of Dove writing Group of Stars, that was one of the first 2 or 3 times he ever typed. So it wasn't like working up from A, B, C. That was, it was the first or second, it was very early in working with Selma. And she was as, you know, when they came over, I kind of thought he was 1 in a million, but that he was this great window into autism, but I never thought it would work for someone else, especially someone who's 9 years old, because she'd been doing it with her son, you know, since he was very little. But it did work, and that was the Galaxy of Stars video clip. I won't show it again. So the next thing that happened, and this is where Heather and I stories converge, is I thought, you know, what if they disappear back to India and it's like this never happened? And it was like this chance or this window, you know, into my son, because I wanted to learn how to do this pointing method. I wanted to see if it would work with more kids. I knew it had to if it worked with Dove. What were the chances? In fact, somebody who observed them once said, oh, they're 2 in a million. Yeah, it's like, oh. But anyway, here we are at Carousel School, which is where Heather is a teacher. And Tito came in and did a poetry reading. I thought the kids would be inspired if they heard him read some poetry. And Dove had started to type and point, And at the school, they didn't know it. It was like, only a few weeks into it. And so Dove got to show what he could do. And I'll never forget, because he was out in the audience. And one kid after another started coming up. So I started working with them. And, I'm not saying they all started spelling out a lot of words, but these are kids who wouldn't sit in a chair, would sit down. They were very motivated. They were very interested. And a couple of the kids really were able to do something right away. But I'll never forget when this scream came out from the audience, and it was Dove biting his aid. And I was so upset because I was so proud of him, and I said, "Why did you do that?" And he typed out, "It was my turn." I think he was jealous, that he was supposed to be the star, and here were these other kids, doing so well. Do you remember that, Heather? Anyway, there's William, who was one of the... Look at this kid, William, in the bottom. Look at that. This kid has never been trained to point or type or even have joint attention or look at the same thing someone else. Look at his hand. You'd think he'd been doing it forever. That was one of the surprise cases there. So what happened next, and I'm going to just breeze over this part, is that Dove, the people who were studying Tito realized they could study Dove, too. Now, he was not nearly as adept of a typer and pointer, and he still isn't. He still hasn't really caught up with Tito. He hasn't learned to handwrite yet, although we're determined to do it. And we made trips up to UCSF, and they did a lot of tests with him. Let me see here what this is. Oh, okay. Soma began to work with other children, and you've got to see this. This is a little girl who flew in from the East Coast for 3 days to work with Soma in a hotel room. So if you think there's any kid that's too challenging for you, no. Three days. Amazing, isn't it? Part of what Soma does is stay with a kid, no matter what. And she ignores behavior. She can't get her to sit down. Can you imagine this plane trip? The girl's very anxious. She's accommodating her. Once she's got her attention, she keeps her on track like crazy. This is a girl who she, according to her parents at school, she can't read, she can't talk, she's in pre-academic curriculum, because of course they can't tell she knows anything. So I was not going to let her get out of her grips for a second.
Yes, God. Yes, it's a church of God. Yes. Now tell me, do you like going there? Do you like going there? Tell me. Right, very good. Come on, go ahead, come on. Come on, go ahead. Try it. I'll make it easy. Very good. Sometimes you give a miss. Yes.
She's accepting one letter off.
And tell me what else do you
I would too.
Yes, come on, go ahead.
And she's giving her some physical prompts on her leg, like to keep her from exploding off.
And good, come on, go ahead. Come on. Okay, come on, go ahead. Oh, you wanted to say swing? Okay, she likes to swing. Okay, she told you to swing. Okay, you told me a lot.
He's like, oh. When I first met that family, I just thought, this isn't going to work, but it did. Okay. Should I show this, Heather? 60 minutes?
That's good.
Yeah. This is a 7-minute film, and this, I just want to give you an idea, like, Soma came to Dove's school, where Heather was a teacher, and the school had her be a volunteer, and she stayed for 2 years at the school, right? 2 years, year and a half. And we were shooting video once a week because we wanted to document it. I started to tell you before, I was afraid in the beginning, like, what if she left? And it's like we couldn't find them again or something. And I figured if Cure Autism Now would support them for a while, we did it 1 year at a time for a year and a half. And if she could volunteer at the school, there were 9 kids in the class, and then if we videotaped, at least we would have this archive and this evidence that this was effective with at least some kids. And as it happens, it was effective to one degree or another with every kid. I'm not saying every kid just was suddenly, like writing essays, but there was a range from astonishing to much better. Let's see how this goes. So 60 Minutes 2 did a piece on it, and within a week, we had 5,000 emails of people saying, I have a brother, I have a daughter, I have a son, I have a student, how do we do this? And we didn't know what to tell them.
With autism, considered
This is
to
the
be
school.
mentally retarded, locked in their own world, unable to communicate or even think for themselves. That was the prevailing view until now.
96 plus 2 is 89 or 98? We have 92.
Tonight, you'll meet the people who are behind what may be a breakthrough in autism, and watch the remarkable
Sensationalism, sorry.
transformation of autistic children who started to communicate
That's their job.
for the first time after years of silence.
It seemed like I was seeing the kid that had disappeared.
Keep going, I know what you mean, but finish it up.
I was like a kid in a candy shop. I didn't know where to start. What's your favorite color? What do you want to be when you grow up? I mean, all the questions you ask a child over years.
It is a flower, and that's a bulb.
I'm Ben Rapp. I'm Bob's son. I'm Charlie Rose.
I'm Vicki Mabry.
I'm Scott Pelley. Those stories tonight on 60 Minutes 2.
While statistics have been showing a significant rise in children born with autism, an unexpected breakthrough may have happened. It's happened quietly with just a handful of children, but it can have profound implications for nearly 500,000 children in the U.S. alone. They are kids with autism, kids many presume are mentally retarded or locked in their own world, unable to communicate or even to think for themselves. That was the prevailing view of autism until now. Tonight you'll meet the remarkable people who are breaking the silence of autism, a silence that led one couple on a desperate search for a cure.
It's like sometime between your baby's first and second birthday, somebody sneaks into your house late at night, and they steal his mind and his personality, and they leave his body behind.
For Hollywood producer John Shestak and his wife Portia Iversen, it was like something from a horror film.
Well, not really, but
Her son Joe appeared to be developing normally. A happy baby, learning to speak. around 18 months, he lost a few words he had, stopped answering to his name, and disappeared into the frightening world of autism.
I felt so helpless to help him, and yet every minute, every day I saw him getting further and further out of my grasp, and there was no expert out there to stop it.
No, say hi, it's your birthday.
Although there are varying degrees of autism, John and Portia were told their son had the most severe form. They were told he would never speak and probably was mentally retarded. Doctors said there was nothing Portia and John could do for him except give him constant care and get on with their lives. Now, age 10, the only sounds Dove makes are unintelligible. His behavior is filled with uncontrollable movements called stimming or self-stimulation.
People don't want to do stuff with you out here if all you want to do is stim, okay?
How frustrated were you?
The worst times, were when he was in pain of some kind and we couldn't figure out, was it a toothache, was it a stomachache, did he have appendicitis, did he break a bone, and he couldn't tell us.
That's pretty helpless, and everything you were saying, like, you gotta help them, fix them, make them feel better, and you don't even know where to start.
We wait for the feds to sort of actually make.
Portia and John were told there was no cure and that there were very few scientists even doing autism research. So they formed a research foundation called CAN, Cure Autism Now.
That's a huge amount.
In just 7 years, they've raised close to $20 million, making CAN the largest private supporter of autism research in the country. But their biggest breakthrough didn't come in a lab. It came from a boy their foundation brought over from India, a boy who seemed very much like their own son, but with some dramatic differences. This child is challenging every assumption about autism, turning the world of Portia and John and thousands of other parents like them upside down. His name is Tito Mukhopadhyay, seen here when he was 10. Like Dove, he's severely autistic. He too is almost mute and has little control over his body. Now 14, Tito still exhibits all the same symptoms of autism, but he's doing what doctors, researchers, and most parents of autistic children once thought impossible. He has learned to write eloquently and independently about what it's like to be trapped in an autistic body.
I was able to ask Tito things I always wanted to ask my own son, Joe. Why do you flap? Why do you rock? Why can't you look in my eyes? And Tito could answer all these questions.
What do you think the biggest misperception is that people have of people with autism?
So,
What we are seeing in Tito is unprecedented. By definition, people with severe autism have trouble with language, a notion that Tito shatters every time he puts pen to paper. That they don't have any understanding? Any understanding of what?